Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are here tonight with Kane and Tal Hagin. How are you, Tal? How are things? We are here to break down some of the latest goings on here in Israel, Palestine, in the Holy Land. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Tal.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Just finished Shabbat here in Israel, and it's really thank you guys for inviting me to the show.
Absolutely.
Definitely. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, why don't you explain your background? Because you were just telling me a little bit about your studies and stuff. You're studying political science right now, yeah?
Yeah. So currently, at the moment, I'm studying political science at Bar Ilan University. Currently, first year, finishing up. About to go into my finals. Beforehand, I served in the Israeli Defense Force, a mandatory service for 2 years and 7 months, and I've lived in Israel for over 10 years. My background mainly with regard to media is when I was 14 years old, I got involved in media analysis due to what happened in Gaza in 2014, Operation Protective Edge, or the Gaza War. Since then, I was a part of a lot of different right-wing pro-Israel Hezbollah organizations. At a certain point, I felt that it wasn't the direction that I wanted to go in, so at 17, I left. I started doing independent work in regard to how to handle media bias and how to analyze the media yourself. And from then until today, that's what I've been mainly focusing on. My main objective is for factual reporting. It doesn't really matter to me in the grand scheme of things what political side you lean on. What matters to me is that whatever opinion you have, it's based on factual information.
Sure. That's something that is kind of lacking in the mainstream media. We see a lot of kind of misleading headlines and articles. So I think looking at the facts is definitely a fresh way of looking at it, instead of it being very slanted either one way or the other. What do you think some of the impacts of kind of new media and social media have had on the mainstream media in terms of Israel Palestine?
Are you talking about media sites like this, unlike conventional media sites like BBC, Fox News, stuff like that?
Yeah, not even just that, but even like your TikToks, your Instagrams, the way people are consuming media now is different to how it was 10, 15 years ago. How has it kind of changed the battle, if you like, being waged?
Well, media, I would say, conservatively was mainly consumed by whatever mainstream media site that you are watching. If you watch BBC, Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, and you would watch these talk shows, there'd just be some types of discussions. They would give you the major headlines of what's happening that they feel is the most important stories, and you would go about your day. Due to social media, everything is kind of in our face now. Everything is seen as very important for you to know. If you scroll through TikTok, one video will be a stupid little fun challenge, and the next video will be discussing a massacre that occurred in some village around the world. Things are very much in our face. I would say, become saturated with too much information. And the biggest problem I think that a lot of these new ways of information face is there's no accountability. Anyone can upload whatever they want. There's no accountability behind them. There is, of course, the whole sense of cancel culture and canceling people for what they provide. But the problem is that it's sometimes very hard to verify what people are uploading or to know. Because a common thing that I see that people say is, well, you just have to point out fake. You need to know to ask the right questions. But it's impossible for you to know to ask the right questions if you believe that it's factually sound or you trust the site. When your closest friend tells you something that happened in his life, you don't start questioning it. You trust it because it's someone that's close to you. And we, in turn, trust the people that we listen to because we assume that individuals who are giving us information from when we were younger, it was teachers. We never questioned our teachers when we were younger. We just assumed whatever they were telling us was the truth because they're teachers. That's their job, is to educate us. And I think that this has devolved into what we see today with social media, of us trusting influencers, us trusting what an actor has to say about a conflict around the world, or what a professor in one field in sociology has to say about something going on with the economy. It's the sense of authority that people seem to have nowadays. So I would say that the main issues are accountability, in terms that anyone can say whatever they want, and it's very hard to hold them accountable for that. And then people not really knowing how to analyze these things at the end of the day.
Yeah, I would say also that there's a generational aspect to it, because, you know, people over the age of like 50, maybe 40 are still sort of consuming, you know, conventional forms of media, watching the news on TV and such. And, you know, people of the younger generations are probably, you know, utilizing these other newer forms that you can access straight through your phone or on social media. And maybe there is some correlation between that and the way people think. It's hard to say, but I'm interested to know, do you think that things like 4chan and, you know, the sort of where the media game seems to be going, do you think that that's going to help with people being more accurate in their opinions? Do you think that, not accurate in their opinions, but knowing more factually accurate information, do you think it helps or detracts?
How do you think, wait, what is, can you give me some context on the 4chan? Like, what is that? What would it have to do with taking accountability?
Well, because with 4chan you have, it's anonymous and also it's evanescent, right? It disappears. So with that, I think people are more prone to take risks with the things they post. If it can't be traced back to you and it's going to disappear after a while, then you're probably more likely to just, you know, you control if you want, just put up whatever, and you're not really held that accountable for it. But still people might see it and remember it.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a larger issue in regard to the internet, is anonymity. As people can say whatever they want, they're not held accountable to it. We see it with edgy humor, or people who say racist slurs or stuff like that, or say very, very harmful things to other individuals that they would never say in their day-to-day lives. But when people can't be held accountable for the things that they say, then there's an issue there. And you could ask, well, why should someone be held accountable? The question that I should ask is that, if you feel so freely to say these things on the internet because you believe in them, then you should also have no issue with having your face attached to it. Anything that I say online, the reason that I have my full name on the screen is because I stand by what I say. If I say something online in an anonymous fashion, and then in the real world I don't say that, then I have to start questioning whether or not there's credibility. Now, of course, there is in regard to certain countries where you have limitation on freedom of speech, and saying certain things with a certain identity can put you in harm's way. So there is that balance that needs to be. I can understand where sometimes anonymity comes from and the need for it to get certain information out there without the fear of organizations or government trying to suppress that individual or cause them bodily harm. However, I think that it got to an extent where now it's being abused, where anyone can be anonymous and say horrific things, bully individuals online, spread fake news that leads to incitement and violence, and there's no repercussions for those type of things.
So do you think, my question would be, you know, Tal, is there a way to legislate against like violent and hateful and vengeful content? Because, for instance, during the last conflict with Gaza, I'm somebody from a little bit of a little bit older than you guys, and you know, still attached to the social media generation, but I'm not really into it too much. I don't really understand it that well, but I happened to go into, you know, what was going on there and have a look at some of the Instagram things and the TikTok things, and it seemed to me like it was anti-Semitism and anti-Jewishness and Islamophobia, all of it together on steroids. Because it was like, I mean, I even saw teen girls dancing, burning, you know, Israeli toilet paper, you know, Israeli flag with toilet paper. And this stuff is going out to thousands of people. You know, these people, I don't know why, but they have hundreds of thousands of followers somehow, you know. And this kind of stuff is going out there. So do you think that we need to legislate against that kind of stuff, and how could it be done?
So this is really the main question when it comes to freedom of speech, is how much do we regulate or not? I don't believe in the term hate speech, just because in order for me to delegitimize someone and demonize them and turn them into an animal and someone that people will be willing to stomp on and hurt, I don't need to say that they're horrible people or curse them out. I can simply use certain tactics. I mean, that's how it usually occurs in different countries. You don't outright say that these people are insects and they just they deserve to be destroyed. You slowly dehumanize them through regular things. They're corrupt, they're lying to us, look what they're doing to these people, and etc. And this leads to dehumanization of individuals. We see this a lot with Israelis online, that they post anything that has to do with anything they're doing, eating food or just out. And the second they have an Israeli hashtag or they present themselves an Israeli, they're bombarded with a lot of very hateful comments that are towards them. This double standard is interesting because, for example, if I meet someone from North Korea, I don't then demonize them for what the government does. Same thing with China or the American government, what the American government's done overseas. I then don't put all of the American people into that same picture. This is really due to a big issue online where we generalize people. And that, for example, a good example of this is during, I think it was the 70s or 80s, there was a right-wing extremist Jew who tried to burn down the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Now, he failed at doing this. He wasn't successful. However, he was condemned by everyone across the board. However, in a lot of different Islamic textbooks and educational material, he's labeled as a Zionist that tried to burn it. And now, if you can understand where the issue comes, because instead of simply that this was a right-wing Zionist who was a part of this certain party, he's simply labeled as a Zionist. The same thing could be said with different types of terrorism. For example, with 9/11, we saw this also, where instead of discussing the types of individuals who actually committed the atrocity, it simply was labeled as Muslims. And then the rise of hate crimes against Muslim individuals rose really exponentially because we label people in this general term, and then that hatred goes against them. That's one of the reasons why anti-Semitism rose during this recent conflict, is because Israel is associated with Judaism and the Jewish state. Then people then automatically assume Jews with Israel and whatever the government does. And therefore they start attacking Jews. The same thing has happened when there's been Islamic terror attacks, and suddenly the rise in hate crimes against Muslim people also rose.
Yeah, it's something that really bothers me because you're right, of course, there's a labeling that goes on. And of course you have Muslims who blow up school buses and then claim that they're doing it in the name of Allah and that it's part of their religion. But generally, in the mainstream view, people tend to say, okay, yeah, but that's just what he's saying. And if we look at other Muslims, we know that, it's not what all of them believe. Why is that not good enough when it comes to Israel? Because we have, like you said, the Israeli government makes certain choices. And yet when I condemn certain things that the Israeli government says or does, people will say, yeah, but you're not really doing enough about it because they're still in power. And, I mean, North Korea, yeah, they really don't have much power to get rid of Kim Jong-un, and we do have a functioning kind of electoral system here. So why do you think, though, that people are so happy to just lump all the Jews and all Israelis in together with the government, no matter what they say, whether they condemn what's going on?
Well, I think the main reason is it's a simplification of history. It's very easy to understand a conflict if you simply simplify it and make it us versus them, and we are the heroes, we are the pure victims, and they are the evil tyrants. The second you try to look into these stories and you try to understand where people are coming from and why they believe certain things they do, it becomes a lot more complicated. I think that people have this weird thing where they think that if you try to understand why someone does what they do, you're justifying it or you're condoning it and you agree with it. For example, with 9/11, just going back because it's a famous example that a lot of people can understand, Osama bin Laden wrote in his letter to America where he explained why he did it, where a lot of it had to do with America's involvement in the Middle East. Now, that doesn't justify the attack on innocent American citizens who had nothing to do with it. However, what it could tell us is maybe how America should react to it, as in what can America do to stop other individuals like this from getting to a point where they have these belief systems where they're willing to kill innocent lives. And so the same thing should be in regard to Israel. When we're talking about why the Israeli government is acting in the way it does, or why certain individuals act in the way they do. We need to understand why. A good example of this was, I think it was during 2014, there was a quite infamous video that made its way around, where we saw a bunch of Israelis on a hilltop right outside of Gaza celebrating the bombardment on Gaza. Now, people cannot understand why people would be celebrating such a thing. It's horrific. However, I believe that if you actually understood what happens in Israel, you could understand the complexity of that situation. These individuals, the way that they see it, their narrative, is that Hamas is run by an organization they see as a terror organization that fires missiles at their citizens. The people who live on that border are constantly bombarded with mortar fire, sniper fire, and other terror activities against them. And so when they're seeing the bombardment of Gaza, they're not thinking about civilian casualties. They're thinking about the bombardment of the militants in there who have attacked them. So when they were celebrating, that's what they were celebrating. Does that make it okay?
But it doesn't make it okay, Tal. This is the thing, right? Even in war, you must conduct yourself. Yeah, you must conduct yourself in a certain way.
The point with me seeing this is then, this is the difference. I can either label those individuals as these crazy, warmongering, happy for civilian deaths, or I can understand that they're coming from a place of anger. And so we need to try and talk to them and make them realize that this isn't the way that we should be trying to put our words into actions.
But then, Tal, is that not saying, oh, you can understand the Palestinian perspective in terms of if a woman wakes up tomorrow morning, decides she wants to stab a couple of Jews at a bus station, and she goes off and does that, you can understand why she's doing that because of the frustration of being under occupation and the economic situation over there. In the same way, could you understand the Palestinian side?
Yes. Personally, yes. I think that by us understanding why they do the things that they do, it doesn't mean the individual who went out and committed an attack should be shot and neutralized, and they should go to prison, and that's it. They tried to kill an innocent individual. But then the question is, what do we do in the future? What's the next step? How do we stop the next attack from occurring? Because these things are just going to keep occurring if we set up the same procedures that keep on are in place. As in, we need to understand where these things come from. It's not enough.
Definitely. Yeah. Well,
okay. And in terms of
maintaining the status quo is the big issue, right? Well, for a lot of people, we see it that way. That right now the status quo is almost age old. You know, it's 70 years old almost. We've been in this situation. There's been developments and movement back and forth with borders, all kinds of things. But we do definitely have quite a long-standing status quo that many people in Israel who, let's say, are unaffected, mostly I would say probably in the center, are not really bothered about changing. And many people would also say that it's actually the responsibility of the Israeli government to change that status quo because they have the power, really. They have all the technological advantages and the military advantages. To what degree do you agree with that?
In regard to pertaining the status quo?
Yeah, do you feel that the Israeli government is being lax in, or well, maybe even are they motivated to keep the status quo in place? Does it benefit them?
I think it benefits them because you just have a continuous surge of violence. A big issue, I think, that with the establishment of the State of Israel was when we discussed having a Jewish state, I don't think that we thought about what it means to have a Jewish state or what it means for us to have a long-standing Jewish state and what it's going to mean for us. We simply saw it as a survival of the Jewish people trying to not be a minority ever again and to be in control of our own destiny. And then once we had the state, we suddenly found ourselves with a lot of different issues that have been going to this day. A big issue that Israel's had, which different Shin Bet high intelligence officers have spoken about, is the fact that there are no long-term solutions to anything. You know, when we took control of the West Bank and Gaza in 1967 after the Six-Day War, we didn't think long-term in what this was going to do. For example, would the establishment of settlements in the West Bank, the settlements themselves weren't an issue in terms of Jews wanting to return to home where Jews were. But we still had millions of Arabs that weren't citizens living there. And we weren't thinking, well, this is going to be an issue when we're discussing a two-state solution. But everyone's like, we're not going to think about that now. Let's just think about the next day and the next day instead of thinking about the long term. Classic example that I use is I heard from a friend of mine, for example, there was a village in the West Bank where there was constantly terrorist activities coming out of that village. And so the army went in and they fired a ton of stun grenades and gas grenades, and they basically showed like a show of force on that village. And it was quiet there for a few months, but then it just came back. Because at the end of the day, we might get some peace and quiet for a few months or a few days, but long term, we haven't actually solved anything. When we see this a lot with Israeli policies, that, for example, with the nation state law that was put into place, where it doesn't matter whether or not we're trying to exemplify that this is the Jewish state. We already have so many issues within this state with regard to the relations between Arabs and Jews, and then we just put forth this new policy that doesn't actually help in any regard the relations with Arabs and Jews within the country. First, we need to build and rebuild the connections between Jews and the minority communities before we can even put forth stuff like this. As in, that's a big issue I think that Israel's had, is that all of our policies are all short term. They're not thinking long term in terms of sustainability and not oppressive means, because that's what a lot of Israeli politicians and government officials have talked about, that Israel's leading towards a really bad place if we don't find long-term solutions.
No, I agree, and I think the lack of looking at things long-term is a huge issue, which is why we're going to get onto my next point and talk a little bit about Gaza and what's been going on over there. Because just to let our viewers know, since there was a ceasefire, there have been a return to hostilities, unfortunately. So over the last week, there have been incendiary balloon attacks, which are basically balloons ladled with incendiary devices, which then float over the border and can land pretty much anywhere, but they usually land in open spaces and burn lots of land and fields. And in response, the new Israeli government has carried out airstrikes in Gaza in response to those balloon attacks. So, Tal, I'd like to hear, your thoughts on it, and how can we, instead of being short-sighted with our response to Hamas, how can we look at things with a bit of a longer-term view and maybe a more strategic outlook?
Well, I think it was quite obvious that Israel is going to react with force against the incendiary balloons. I mean, Israel suddenly has a new government. It was quite strategic that the flag march was right after the new government was established, and so everyone was waiting to see how the new government of Israel was going to deal with this new security threat. The incendiary balloons, while they are deadly, they mainly do a lot of economic damage to the farmers there. That's their livelihoods. That's essentially what it destroys most of all. And so this is a real harm for the communities that live down there. In short term, it's hard. It's very hard for me as an individual, or even if I was in an organization, to expect the Israeli government to hold back, because even if long term that's the right solution, we look weak amongst the Israeli people if we don't fight back. If you hit us, we have to hit back. I don't remember exactly what the targets were of those Israeli strikes, whether or not they were on the actual units that were deploying the balloons, or whether or not it was other targets.
I think it was other targets.
Other targets. So I think it would have been better for us to simply direct our fire exactly at the individuals who fired the incendiary, as in minimize as much as possible any type of civilian casualties that could occur, like to the furthest extent that we can. And then from there, I think that a lot of different changes have to happen within regard to how we handle Gaza in general. But it's a complicated story, because Hamas and the way that it governs, and the Palestinians that are living there, are furthest from wanting any type of negotiations and peace with us as Israeli Jews. I mean, if we can't even find negotiations with the Israeli Arabs living in our own cities and towns, then how are we expected with the people of Gaza? So I think that it's very hard for me to expect any type of diplomatic relations with these countries, with Gaza, when we can't even have any type of relations with. We don't even have a Arab party. I think now we do, but we didn't really have any Arab party that was representing even the Arabs when our own country and looking out for them. So how can we expect to do anything with Gaza? I think it really has to start from within first Israel's proper borders, then within the West Bank, and then move on to Gaza. As in, I think it has to be a building effect.
Okay,
Yeah.
so wait 1 second, Kane. 1 second. I just want to ask Tal something quickly. So you think basically that we should focus on ourselves, let Gaza get on with Gaza. We shouldn't interfere with anything. Let's try and focus on internal politics and on internal issues. And when they're ready to play ball, they can come to us. That's the kind of angle.
Well, I think that there has to be. The question is, how do we handle with Hamas? We don't know if there's back channels with Hamas, with the IDF or the Israeli government that goes on. We don't know really how much relations actually occur. I mean, if you look in history, there's always these different back channels that go between organizations or governments or organizations. Yeah. And so the question is, to what extent that is, how open is the dialogue? And that's really up to the highest levels of the echelons of the Israeli security services. But I think it would be good if Israel were to have more negotiations with Qatar and Egypt, and trying to put pressure on them to try to improve the situation in Gaza, as in with the type of funds that are going into Gaza, to put more pressure on them that they should be putting more of the efforts into their own infrastructure than attacking Israel, because it doesn't do any good for their own people at the end of the day. And I think, honestly, of course, there is the argument that I've seen from Palestinians where they discuss the fact that, well, we might as well fight back because they're not going to give us anything else. But I think one of Israel's major arguments to counter Palestinians, at least when it comes to Gaza, is look what happens when we give up land for peace. Now we have rocket fire against us, and we have this constant issue with Hamas. If Hamas was able to prove Israel wrong by building a proper Gazan place and infrastructure and improving the situation there, then I think that would take away Israel's defense card and force Israel into a place where it had to reevaluate the situation. Because right now, Israel only looks at Gaza from a security standpoint. But if Gaza found itself in a place where it could prove Israel wrong in terms of its ability to govern itself and be prosperous, then it could put more diplomatic pressure on Israel, because Israel would lose its leverage.
But that would kind of be a good thing in a sense.
It would be a great thing. That's the thing. But that's a type of resistance that would work against Israel, because right now Israel's justification, justified or not, Israel's justification against not giving more land for peace or for negotiating with Hamas or negotiating with the Palestinians is the good disengagement and the current Gaza leadership, which is Hamas. If they could prove us wrong, prove us as in the Israeli government wrong by showing here we can be very prosperous, then that would also in turn put a lot of different Western organizations and governments against us, because right now it's very hard for a lot of different Western organizations and governments to support Hamas because of their charter, because of the things that they say, and also because they're designated by the United States and other governments as a terror organization. So a lot of different governments don't really want to have anything to do with them. But if they were able to, put their assets and what they need into different areas, and instead try to rebuild Gaza and make Gaza into a livable area, then they could put more diplomatic pressure in terms of their other goals, which is the right of return and citizenship and other things. Now, of course, these are very complicated matters in terms of where does that leave Israel. But I think that long term, it's the best way for Palestinians to achieve what they want is by going through the peaceful means. It also would make a lot more Israelis sympathetic to the cause, because every time that a rocket is fired at Israel, no matter if it's justified or not, more Israelis become more extreme. Every single time a rocket is fired, because they start feeling for their lives more and more and more, and they don't want to have any type of peace with them. So if suddenly they find themselves proved wrong, where you have kids growing up that don't have the fear of rocket fire and don't have the fear of that, then you would have a change. The West Bank is a completely different story, and I also have ways that I think that we could deal with that. But in regard to Gaza, I think it mainly has to do with taking away the fear that Israelis have by showing Gaza becoming a prosperous place.
Yeah. And, I would be interested to see how the Israeli public at large would react to something like that, seeing that there's actually a change taking place in the Gaza, and not necessarily Hamas, it probably will be. There's not much chance of them disappearing, but Gaza making positive changes. I'd be interested to see how people react to that here, because, of course, there are people who hate just because they don't really have the sophistication of thought to to understand that, you don't have to just hate. If there's something improving, then you can change your opinions. I heard I don't know about a daily basis, but I hear quite frequently Israelis who are fairly extremist in the things they say. And I do have to wonder whether or not that is as a response to the hate coming from the other side, because hate begets hate, of course.
I think there's always a response. We can keep going back in every single attack and every single bullet fired and discuss that this was a response to this and this was a response to this. It just keeps going back and forth, but it's more about understanding where do we go forward.
For sure.
I think that it can't come from Israel. Israel can't have anything to do with Hamas's leadership because Israel's seen as an enemy state and we're not friendly with them. There's no reason that a Gazan should trust me or the Israeli government in terms of what our aspirations are and what our goals are. I mean, at the end of the day, whether justified or not, we're the ones bombing them. So they see us as an enemy. I think it has to come from wherever their funding is coming from. And we're not saying that they should stop the funding to these areas, but that the funding should be going exactly where they tell it to. For example, when you find a tunnel that's being used to attack Israel, that it has the logos of humanitarian aid being given, then I think they should be cut off from funding. As in the best way for Hamas to be forced into a position where it has to care more for its own people is by cutting off the funding when it doesn't do so. The funding for the Gazan people by international aid groups and governments is for the Palestinian people in Gaza to prosper. And firing at Israel doesn't actually help their goals. It only gives Israel more of a justification to put more.
It doesn't, but it helps Hamas goals. It helps Hamas's goals, and that's the people who count. That's what counts in Gaza at the moment,
Yeah, because Hamas is only seen it exactly as, and it's like, we'll suffer as much as possible as long as we can attack Israel. Exactly. So that's why I don't see any type of direct communication with Hamas. I think I'm pretty sure that Hamas would start changing its tune if suddenly money started getting away. Because if suddenly the Gazan people don't have food because governments are blaming Hamas, not Israel, then the Palestinian people in Gaza would go against Hamas.
So why has this cash been coming in then to Gaza from Qatar and stuff for the last year and a bit? Why has that cash been coming in if as you say it should be stopped?
Well, of course some of it is. Well, some of it of course does go to humanitarian aid. I mean, it's not all going to different activities, military activities against Israel, but a large portion of it is, obviously. If they're able to construct the amount of tunnels and the amount of rockets that they're firing at Israel, then they are able to. So I think it would be about putting different types of sanctions and policies against these governments that are doing so. I mean, it's not really in their interest to be doing so. They probably have some types of deals with other governments and other different regimes on why they're doing this. So it would be about offering them a better deal to not do so, for them to have an alternative. They'd also have to have a change from the Israeli government. I think that Israel would have to work directly with these other nations to show that Israel is coming from a good place, and that it does want to see Gaza prosper. Because whether or not justified, the blockade that Israel has on Gaza for the security reasons that it puts forth, it's not good for them. So I think that if Israel was saying that we are willing to lift the blockade as long as we're seeing efforts being put towards the funding being put solely towards humanitarian efforts, and that any of this funding going directly to Hamas will put a stop to it, essentially. And I do believe that they can put these type of... I mean, Qatar, America has one of the largest military bases in Qatar. And Egypt has tons of different relations with Israel. And it's not like these countries are completely on their own and they can do whatever they want. If there's enough pressure from external governments, they can pressure these governments into acting in a better way. I think it's in everyone's interest. It's another way. It goes, and essentially it is a way to fight against Israel, but it's in a way that I think in the long term does a lot better. I don't think that this conflict should be fought over blood. If that's a way that you want to go, fine. But every time we go that route, more and more kids die, and that's not the route that we should want to have to go.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree with you there, Tal, and we definitely need to look at things from a different angle. My real, the real issue and roadblock that I see to this, anything happening in the future is Palestinian unity. As long as you have a fractured Palestinian system, which you have at the moment with Hamas controlling Gaza and the PA controlling over parts of the West Bank and there being other splinter groups, Israel doesn't actually have anyone to negotiate with that is seen as the be all and end all legitimate, okay, we can, settle this once and for all, either one state, two states, however we're going to do it. So the real question is, how, in your eyes, can you see some form of Palestinian unity coming about, either if that's for Hamas or if that's getting rid of Hamas and the PA taking over?
Now, so this answer is going to sound more of like putting all the blame on one side, but this is something that I was told a long time ago, but I didn't really understand it, and something I've recently understood is that it's up to Israel to start that process. Palestinians are fractured because they feel hopeless. They don't feel like they have any negotiation. You have Abu Mazen, who hasn't really done much for the Palestinian cause. Mm-hmm. You have Hamas, that all they do is govern over Gaza, and we already discussed what happens there. And so Palestinians don't really feel like they have anyone who can fight for them. And so then all they have to deal with was Netanyahu for all these years and other different leaders. A few of the different things that they wanted was the main things, the reason that they rejected different peace plans had to do with citizenship and right of return. And that those are things for them non-negotiators. But I think that the main thing has to do with security policies. We recently saw that they decided to lift the policy of using Palestinian homes for gathering intelligence and for training. Sure. I think it's a really good thing. I think that
I agree.
I think that collective punishment should be stopped completely. I think that we have to react less extremely to terrorism. And what I mean by that is that when we find the individuals who committed a terror attack against Israeli citizens, they should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But we shouldn't be then isolating the rest of the community and having them, because it's just innocent people who go into the line of fire essentially from these type of individuals. I think that also when it comes to rock throwing incidents, especially during different types of protests or riots, I think there should be a lot more leniency in terms of just backing up and letting them do what they do and only going for the main instigators, individuals. I know that Israel does mainly go for the instigators, but there's a lot of different events. The main thing I think that would do a lot of good things is that a lot of Palestinians talk about accountability, that we see that a lot of the IDF soldiers aren't essentially get a slap on the wrist for different things that they did. Elor Zaria, who took the law into his own hands and killed and neutralized terrorists because he was upset at what he had done, only got 9 months out of an 11 months sentence that was classified as manslaughter in the end. We have a soldier who went against the code of conduct on the Gaza border and killed a 15-year-old who had, he went to the fence and he was, I didn't see the video, but he probably tried cutting through. Instead of just being detained or, smoke grenade at him, he never got any type of clearance to shoot, which they have to get, and he did on his own accord. He only got a month, and he then has community service. He should have been put into jail for that. And I think that also when we take accountability for our own soldiers and the things that they do, we could be in a much better situation. And Palestinians, I think, would see that, because right now they just feel hopeless. They don't feel that anything they do is going to change the situation, so you resort to violence. I don't think that a 15-year-old kid who wakes up and ends up wanting to stab an Israeli, it's not a normal thing for an individual to grow up like that. A part of it has to do with the education system that they receive, but also that's enforced whenever they have to meet Israelis at checkpoints. I mean, the only understanding they have of what an Israeli is the guy at the checkpoint who checks who they are, or that when they have to come home from school, they have to pick up their shirt because they might have a bomb on them. But think about it from the kid's point of view. It's like when I've been at an airport, and I've rarely ever been stopped. But I remember when I once was stopped and I was frisked, I felt really dehumanized. But I understood why they were doing it. I understood, but it didn't matter in that moment. I felt dehumanized, and I can't imagine having to do that every single day.
But wait a second, Israelis, I want to give the classic kind of Israeli pushback to what you're saying, because Israelis will say, look, Tal, for all your goodwill and all this, things that you want to do well for the Palestinians, we need those checkpoints there. We need that security. You weren't here during the first Intifada. You weren't here during the second Intifada. You don't remember buses being blown up in Tel Aviv. You don't remember buses and CAFs being blown up in Jerusalem. They'll say that to you, and then, what would be your response?
Well, it is true that checkpoints have worked. I mean, we saw that there was a huge decline in suicide bombings after the second Intifada due to the security barrier and also different security checkpoints that have been ups. Israel actually has decreased some of its checkpoints in the past few years, and so that's been a good thing. And checkpoints are their main purpose is security, but it is important to realize that they do dehumanize a population, whether or not they're justified. And what I'm saying is not that tomorrow morning we should go to every checkpoint and just clear them all out and just have good faith and will that all the Palestinians are going to be happy with that and not try to use it as an excuse to commit a terror attack. But it is important to realize that the majority of Palestinians that you see that break through the fence and try to get into Israel, or the thousands of Palestinians who are coming into Israel every day, are doing so because they just want to work. They just want to prosper in their own lives. And so this isn't the majority of people. I mean, there are of course the Shabak, the Shin Bet, and Security Secret Service, and all these. They do stop a lot of different attacks that you don't even hear about. I remember during my service, I heard about different things that were never in the news that we had stopped. During the few escalations, there was like a supposed bomb threat that they were able to stop. And so these are really important things that happen. However, I think that instead it should be a lot more pinpointed to the actual individuals. For example, I don't personally see the need for destroying the home of an individual who commits an attack. I don't think that helps in any situation. I don't think that it helps the situation. Really. Like, for example, if I murder someone, does the government then destroy my house? It doesn't help. It only acts as a collective punishment against these individuals. And I haven't seen any type of source actually, from what I've understood, there's been more terror attacks from it. It doesn't actually stop terrorism destroying the houses. It just kind of feels like a payback. Like your son did this, so we're going to destroy your house. And anyways, the Palestinian Authority is going to then just give them another house or just help them rebuild. So it doesn't really do anything. But all they feel is my son, because of something that he saw or some traumatic event, he decided to go out and try to kill innocent people. And so why do I have to suffer for that? And that just brings forth. So it's not about just one day, we wake up and there's no more checkpoints, but it's about gradually decreasing the amount of security presence that we have as good faith is shown. So they would have to understand that it would also help them, because think about it, for an individual who wants to go and work, if suddenly the security from their village into Israel to work is decreased from 3 hours waiting to 1, then they're also going to discourage violence and incitement from within their own communities, because they don't want these individuals doing this, and then they're going to be screwed over essentially from it.
Yeah.
So I think it would also come from the collective of these individuals. So I think the first step, I think, from Israel would have to be about more pinpointed measures against individuals who commit terror attacks against Israel, and stop with different types of punishments or actions or policies that can be seen as collective punishment.
Yeah. So can I just make
one second?
Yeah,
because it's not a really long point. There is just with regards to what you're saying about these I don't want to call them lone soldiers, because that's already a thing. These soldiers that take matters into their own hands. There is something to be said for having a huge amount of the manpower we have being 18-year-old, 19-year-old kids who are just becoming adults and learning the ways of the world. And, of course, there's lots of reasons for that. And we don't have a huge country full of our population's not that big when you compare it to bigger countries. So we don't have a huge amount of choice. But of course, when you have young gung-ho kids who have been raised by perhaps kind of extreme parents, maybe not, but either way, kids who are still learning to be adults, having guns put in their hands and having to make the decision, is this serious enough that this person needs to be killed? Isn't it? And also, they're still kind of coming out of their, hormonal teen years where they're emotional and making emotionally based decisions. So when you get like El Azaria shooting someone that didn't need to be shot because he was already neutralized, it's absolutely, it's inexcusable, but it's also, I think, a product of the fact that he's in that position in the first place, being the age he was.
Well, I think it's important to remember that, the people who fought in World War I and II were also our age. Soldiers are young, and there's a lot of reasons why that is. I think with regard to the West Bank and the situation with Palestinians is, think about it. We Israeli Jews are the most. I went out and talked to Palestinians myself. Like, I put the effort into actually doing this. But for the majority of Israeli Jews, the only times they ever hear about Palestinians is from a terror attack that occurs. So their only understanding of Palestinians is violence. And so suddenly when they're in the army, they simply see everyone as an enemy. And so they're going to be constantly on guard, and they're not going to know if someone's just being nice or they're a threat to them. And it becomes a very complex situation for these individuals who are standing there. The importance of the arms in terms of what we're supposed to do, we are taught that. I remember when I was with a gun, I was taught the importance of having a weapon and what it means, and that, the power that you have in your hands. I remember I was guarding at an area, and there was a guy just tending to his fields, an Israeli Jew, but it was at the settlement area, and I was just there for a week with the guarding there. And I remember, he was at his field and it was getting late, so I told him, hey, I need you to go back to your house. It's getting late and I don't want to misidentify you and have to start the whole protocol. And he went, and I thought that moment, I was just like, this is just some 40-year-old guy who I just told to leave the area, and he did. I just felt like I have an insane amount of power. I'm just a guy walking around with a weapon, and I can essentially tell people around me what to do because I have that power. And I think it's a very dangerous thing as well when you have, these young guys at that age who suddenly have so much power in their hands that they don't always know how to use it correctly. But I do think that they have to be a lot. I'm not saying that if someone's running at you with a knife that you don't shoot. There's different situations, but I think that when soldiers are encouraged to speak in a certain way, I've heard of the way that certain commanders or soldiers speak, and then they're not condemned by their fellow comrades. Then you have in the society this thing, it's not that big of a deal, and we're in charge or we're defending, and we have to do anything is acceptable. And it's about getting away from that. That's why I think about accountability, that soldiers should be held accountable for things that they do. You're not a kid at the end of the day at that age. You are considered an adult, and if you can be charged, I'm just saying, in general, if you at 18 can murder someone and be charged in full as an adult, and as a soldier, if you misuse your weapon or you do something that you're not supposed to do, then the job of the army when you were in training was to bring you to a point where you know what you're doing. And so at that point, and you need to know what you're doing in the field and what your protocol is, how much you can exert power over the other individuals that are around you, and nothing beyond that. Anything you do is in your capacity. I knew that when I was guarding, and I think everyone knows that. Anyone who takes the matters into their own hands should be held accountable for it.
They should, yeah. And, you're right about that for sure. Although World War II, Israel and the West Bank, we have checkpoints where we're right on top of them almost, and we interact so much more often. With the world wars, in Germany.
My only point there is that the thing that just because you're young, it doesn't mean that you're not prepared to fight or that you're not able to do these things. Most wars are fought by young people. It's not an exception that Israel has young people on the front line. That's my point.
No, that's true. So maybe that points then to some sort of systematic issues with the military and the way that they are training people. That everyone knows that we have to rush into the training, rush through the training. And there's an ambulance, but so that seems to be an issue, I think. 1 second, I just wanted to finish, let that go past. So what I was saying is, it seems to be an issue that maybe there's too much rushing, or maybe there's just not enough of a screening process to check which soldiers are mentally competent and which ones are emotionally competent enough to be in those positions.
But there are pretty good checks though, Kane. There are I would suggest that eventually Israel would need to move to a type of British model. Professional army. At the end of the day, professional soldiers will make far better soldiers than a 19-year-old kid who doesn't want to be there, who wants to be at a bar in Tel Aviv or at the beach, and he's now in the middle of Hebron or whatever, So I think, professional army is definitely the way to go. And it's something that can be implemented. I really do think that.
I agree with that, because a big issue is that unless you're in the elite units, it's pretty hard to get kicked out of the training and to not go through. You have to either be medically just, you're not able to, you broke a leg, or you have a lot of different medical issues, or you have to be really, really, really problematic. But there have been stories of suicidal people who have gone through, or people with mental issues that they still let them become. The army has that people are just let through. I remember that there was a guy in my basic training who I remember we told that he was going through some stuff, and we were actually afraid that he would like fire his gun at someone because we were afraid. And we told the commander at the gun range, and she was like, "It's fine." As in, there isn't that much of a concern, because when you have an army that's based off of everyone has to draft, it's just like we don't have the time to like start selecting everyone in terms of stuff like that. I mean, it's important to realize that the whole country isn't. It's a lie that that everyone drafts. It's not true. I think last statistic I saw that was like 50% of people who are supposed to draft. Not people that, not like the Haredim, that like the ultra Orthodox communities or the Arabs that do not draft. I'm talking about the 50%, the 100% of people that are supposed to draft. 50% of them don't. A lot of people in this country already aren't drafting, and a lot of them are trying to get out, and for a lot of different reasons.
Agreed.
But unless you're in an elite unit, you don't get it's really hard to get kicked out. So there's a very good chance that you have people who are in the front lines who shouldn't be there. In a professional army, you just get kicked out.
It's true.
Yeah,
it's true.
That's right.
Tal, I did want to move into another little topic, because it's definitely it was a hot topic this week, and it's probably going to come up again, considering these things seem to happen all the time. I want to get into the whole flag demonstrations and the flag demonstration specifically that went on at Damascus Gate, Shar Shem, or Bab el Amud in Arabic. Can you give a little brief outline to our viewers of what happened and what you think about the flag demonstration, and if it's something that even is needed?
So the flag demonstration, this one in particular, was in response to Hamas. Hamas, during the Jerusalem Day, had an ultimatum that if Israel didn't remove its forces from Al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa compound, and remove the Jewish settlers from Shikha, this is all like their statements, the way that they said it, then they were going to fire missiles, rockets at Israel at 6 p.m., which they did, because Israel didn't agree. They ignored it completely. So Hamas said that, this was essentially, this whole protest was a response saying that we're not afraid, we're not going to give in to the demands of terrorists, and we're going to wave the flag proudly in our own country and in our own cities. And so that was the core message that was being given. However, a very common thing that happens with these marches, this happens also every year with the Jerusalem Day Parade, is a lot of anti-Arab sentiment goes about in these protests, especially when they get to Damascus Gate and through the Muslim Quarter. You start hearing calls for the death of Arabs. You hear comments very disrespectful regarding the Prophet Muhammad in the faith of Islam. And these happen every year. And it's not one or two people, it's crowds of people who do these things. And no one stops them. The fact that I remember going to one of these flag marches with my school when I was in, I think, 9th grade. And I remember going to Damascus Gate and suddenly hearing all these chants around me, and I was very confused. And this happened years ago, and the fact that this still happens every single year shows that this isn't being stopped. I think that's the big issue. As in, I don't think that these marches do any good for us. While the core message I think is good in terms that we're not going to give in to the demands of an organization that I'm talking about Israel sees as a terror organization, which is a good message. At the end of the day, I feel that these marches do a lot more harm. I mean, how does it look to an Arab in that area that they were prohibited from moving around their own area where they live and their shops during that time? They weren't allowed to move around. Jews were. You have, police officers standing around while people are screaming death to Arabs and doing nothing to them. And are they going to feel any type of resonance with the state of Israel and feel any type of sense of being proud to be a citizen of this country? No. They feel even more disassociated. I think that the same with these marches. One, I don't think that they should go because, it's not like in day to day, a lot of these marches they come from fear. They come from the current situation with terrorism and war and conflict. And this march is about, pride and nationalism and we are on top. But it also is coming from there is a part of it that comes from, a fear of the other. And that other is the Arabs that are the enemies, because who is the ones committing intifadas against us? Who's the one raging wars against us? Arabs. And so there's a sentiment against them. So when they're going through Damascus Gate, they're not laughing and cheering and talking with the Arabs that are there. They're harassing them, or they're antagonizing, or they're in their face like, you won't get rid of us. As in, these marches aren't coming from a place of we're all one people and we're all together. They're coming from a place of we're here and you're not going to stop us. But a lot of these people are just innocent people just trying to live their lives. They aren't the individuals. Most of them are individuals who hate us. And these places usually end very, very badly. I would not expect the same. I wouldn't accept an Arab march through the Jewish quarter screaming "Death to Jews," and that would be stopped right away. And I shouldn't expect. What I think that should happen is that the way that I see it with protests in general. I was asked. There was someone who was talking about like, why shouldn't I go? Because the message is really good. As in, if you're going to any type of protest or march and people around you are screaming for the murder of other people and you stand there, you're a part of it. You're complicit. That's it. Either you leave or you forcibly try to get people to stop. A really good example of this is there was a protest against Bennett. So like Bennett, a lot of right-wing Israelis were against Bennett forming a coalition with parties that they saw as the left-wing parties that didn't agree with. So there was a protest outside his house. And there was a woman with a megaphone who started saying that we should hang Bennett and we should kill Bennett. And another woman right next to her grabbed the microphone from her hand and yelled at her. And that's what I'm saying is if the women around her allowed her to say that and just kept on letting this woman spout her stuff, they're as complicit in that as the woman is. If you stand next to a sign that says "Death to Jews," I'm very much doubtful that if these people saw a pro-Palestinian march and someone was waving a "Death to Jews" banner, and all the people were just standing around like, no, we're here for the Palestinians. We don't agree with this. But if they just walk with that sign next to them, they're complicit. They're a part of it. And so
I agree.
These individuals should be stopped. Or another great thing that should happen is that with the Israeli police, that the second you have tons of people screaming this stuff, they should be dispersed. That's it. No more march. You don't get a march anymore. As in, what that would do is that anytime some idiot starts with their silly little insightful chants, other people would shut them up. Not because they don't agree with them, but because they're going to stop us. The police are going to take away this march. I can promise you that if there was a march in the country with Israeli Arabs and they were screaming "Death to Jews," that it would be dispersed right away, and as it should be. And the same thing should happen to these individuals. If you're screaming for the death of innocent people, then you shouldn't be marching.
Yeah,
no, I fully agree with you.
If we're claiming to be the good guys and we're trying to say that we are trying to set the example of searching for peace, then we can't have double standards like that. I totally agree with you.
Go on, Kane. No, I just want to make a point to all these flag wavers, their heart's in a good place, not the ones that are chanting "Death to Arabs," because obviously their hearts are way in the bad place, and they need de-radicalization, and they actually need help. Like, they need psychological help, those people. But I'm talking about to your average person who went to the march, who's waving his flag around, who's supporting of Israel. Your efforts might be way better made if you went and set up a new settlement in the Galilee or in the Negev, or invested in Israeli high-tech, or set up a new startup, or even go and clean up the environment. All these things that I said are better than waving a flag around for a day. For me anyway, going, because I can go to Jerusalem any day I want and I can wave a flag around any day I want. But, there are a huge amount of people that went down there. I'm not too sure on the numbers, Tal, but it was thousands, right? It was thousands of people.
There was a large amount of people. I don't have exact numbers for you.
Yeah, it was a lot of people. A lot of people can do a lot of things in a couple of days. They could have set up a new town in the Negev, and I just think that it's good-hearted people putting the eggs in the wrong basket.
A lot of it comes from frustration. It's about being upset about the current situation. That's why these things happen. Violence at protests and people resulting in using inflammatory language like this. It comes from somewhere, but we shouldn't condone it. We shouldn't allow it to get to a point where it's allowed. And that's the problem. Is as much as people want to say that we condemn it, the fact that this happens every single year with large numbers tells me we condone it, that we aren't stopping it. There should have been a counter protest that should be set up, and they not go through Damascus Gate and not have these insightful and go against it, and so that this isn't who we are and we don't accept this. And I do agree that there are different ways of. I am personally, this is more of a different note. I always have had an issue with protests in general. A good example of this is a few weeks ago, there was a peace protest by a left-wing activist in Tel Aviv. There was like 300 or 400 people. And I went there more as a journalist. I went there just to film, just to take photographs. And I saw everything from, religious people who were just talking about more peace with the Palestinians to people who are just all out like communist activists, everything, the whole spectrum. And so when I'm there, I'm just like, what is the actual goal of this place? Like, that's the thing. I saw all the way from, I hate the current administration, to we want a communist nation, a communist economy, to I want a free Palestine from the river to the sea. I want a two-state solution, everything. And they're all marching together. And I'm just like, what are you actually fighting for? And the same thing when you have right-wing protests where, some people are talking about the changing government, or some people are talking about left-wing, or some people are talking about a one-state solution with no Palestinian, or something about two-state solution. And so a lot of the times protests mainly come from a place of anger and anguish, and they're trying to get their voices heard. Yeah. But I don't think there's usually a clear goal. And that's why I don't join it.
Yeah, no, I see your point, Tal. I see your point. And maybe, here's something that just came to mind while you were saying things. Maybe direct action is what's needed and less protesting. So, for example, I'm not sure if you're aware of the footballer Marcus Rashford over in the UK. He's known for his football, but he's also known for his charity work and his stuff off the field. So he actually managed to change a government policy in the UK. There was basically outcry over the fact that basically people under a certain poverty line in the UK get free meals, and the government was going to take that away from those children. And Marcus Rashford led a huge effort, got it out there, petitioned, went completely against the government. And in the end, his celebrityism and, that kind of place in society helped him gain leverage, and the government backed down on it and made sure that all free school meals are kept. So do you think that that's something that could work here, like direct action from Israelis and Palestinians on making changes on the ground? So like, for example, one would be the situation in the Negev at the moment is untenable with the crime rates and the Bedouin situation, with them not being recognized villages, not having facilities. Could Israelis and Bedouins get together, lobby, petition against the government and get them to act? Is that something that could happen here?
Yeah, because I think, for example, it's about sometimes when we deal with the symptoms and not the actual problem, there's a very large amount of crime from the Negev, mainly from the Bedouin communities. But that's mainly due to the fact that poor communities tend to have more crime in them because they're in a situation where that's something that occurs. And so when you have Bedouin communities that are mainly living in poverty, the main outlet, one of the best outlets for them to earn the most amount of money is through crime. And so I think that by having petitions and trying to lobby the government into providing better facilities for the Bedouin communities could do a long way. I think that a great example of is after the Meron tragedy, where 45 ultra-Orthodox individuals were killed during a failure of the facilities there. There was Arab villages that brought food and water and tried helping out with the rescue efforts and stuff like that with the individuals. I think that, for example, in response to the whole point, it was about, issues going on in Jerusalem and tensions. And I think a better way of dealing with it would have been having some type of joint demonstration with Arabs in Jerusalem, talking about the situation and trying to settle issues. And yes, it is coming from more of a, like a hippie type, peace type way of thinking. But I think that's much better than going the route of, let's just wave a flag in their face and scream, we hate you and you're not with us and stuff like that. I think that it goes a much farther way. It also, if you want to talk about advocacy and how you just look much better to the world when you do stuff like that. Right. Just also strategically, it's a much better way to go about things in terms of how you view. I remember a few years ago there was during increased tensions, there was a whole. I remember this. I don't know if this happened in the end because of issues, but they wanted to do it in Lobbying Square, a big sit down between Israelis and Palestinians to ask each other questions, and this was during tension and stuff like that. So stuff like that, I think action is much better. Like this is a great example of a celebrity, someone who's famous for something that has nothing to do with politics or social issues, using his platform for really good purposes. And I think that's something that a lot of people should have done, individuals who are at a higher level.
Absolutely.
For sure. No, I definitely think that needs to be an avenue that needs to be explored a lot more over here. And grassroots efforts are, for me, the best way to go at getting the ball rolling. Of course, at the end of the day, it's going to be us against some form of Palestinian government that is going to sign a deal at the end. But it's the grassroots efforts, and it's the dialogue between different sides that will really help get the ball rolling.
We can't expect these. The whole thing. I always find it hilarious when, for example, with Trump's peace plan, has nothing to do with Trump, but the fact that they're putting a peace plan between Israelis and Palestinians, and I'm thinking, Israelis and Palestinians don't even want to talk to each other at the moment. So what is the point of doing a peace plan between governments if the people on the ground don't even want to have any conversation with one another? As in, it has to come from the bottom up, not top bottom.
Exactly. No, I fully agree, Tal. Fully agree. Well, we're just coming towards the end of our time now for tonight, Tal. But it's been a real pleasure. We could have stayed talking for another hour or two and got into. We didn't even touch on the West Bank or the things in the north or Hezbollah or Iran. So there's still plenty more to talk about another time.
There's always something going on.
Of course. So thank you very much, and thank you, Kane, for being here with us as well for the conversation. It's been brilliant, guys.
Thank you for having me.
Just want to wish you guys a good week.
You too.
And
go check out our links, check out our Instagram and our Facebook page, and show your support. Because as Tal just said, the best way is from the ground up, and it's not going to come from top down.
Agreed.
There you go. Thanks very much, guys. Subscribe and like below. See you next time.